Greetings and salutations everyone, my name is Andrew Kirkoff and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're talking about my Week 12 wide receiver rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be covering a variety of topics, starting off with some news around the National Football League as it pertains to Thursday night football. After that, we'll talk about some wide receivers, specifically matchups at the wide receiver position and which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. After that, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings on the week. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys for your incredible support. Again, for those of you who have helped us get to 34.8K subscribers, I cannot thank you guys enough. I'm really thankful for you guys. For those of you from the beginning, in the days of where it was just a couple hundred subs, and now I really do appreciate all of you guys' support. For those of you who have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. We are on our way to 35,000 subs. Click the like button and comment down below. You can find timestamps down in the description of the video where you can find a specific player that you're looking for. While you're down there in the description of the video, you can of course find the Patreon link for those of you who are trying to find extra content outside of the channel, getting all of your 2020 fantasy football questions answered and exclusive flex rankings. Outside of that, the Discord server is also in the first line of the video for those of you who are looking to join that. Otherwise, thank you again for your guys' support, and let's get into our Week 12 wide receiver rankings. But before we do so, I want to go ahead and talk about a couple pieces of information going into Thursday night football. Again, there were 3 games slated for the Thursday, Thanksgiving extravaganza of sorts, right? We had the Dallas Cowboys playing against the Washington football team. We have the Detroit Lions playing against the Houston Texans, and the night game was supposed to be the Baltimore Ravens versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. That game has been delayed to Sunday. So again, for those of you who are anticipating the possibility of playing Gus Edwards this week, we mentioned it on yesterday's video, there is a chance that if in fact J.K. Dobbins and or Mark Ingram can be cleared this week and can play this upcoming Sunday, then we would of course adjust the rankings accordingly for a guy like Gus Edwards. So again, there's always an outside chance for those players to come back this week and end up playing on Sunday if in fact they are cleared 5 consecutive days in a row. So that is the main piece of information I wanted to cover. Outside of that, we're good to go. There'll only be 2 games tomorrow. That's unfortunate, but either way, let's get into some wide receiver matchups for Week 12 of the 2020 fantasy football season. We'll throw up the graphic as we typically do. The Seattle Seahawks, of course, are giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers. They do that every single week. The amount of yards they give up is just incomprehensible at some point. They're getting torched. And it doesn't matter which team they play, but luckily for them, they play against the Philadelphia Eagles, an offense that, as of right now, hasn't proven that their wide receivers are good enough on a weekly basis to be able to take advantage of said matchup. But either way, the Dallas Cowboys, they are the next team on the list in terms of giving up points to opposing wide receivers. This obviously bodes well for only one guy on the Washington football team, that is Terry McLaurin, going into this week. The Atlanta Falcons give up a fair share of points. Nelson Aguilar, who I've mentioned and we talked about earlier this week on the waiver wire edition episode, he is an every other week kind of guy in terms of scoring a touchdown. Sure, you want to go ahead and maybe fire him up and find some relevance this week because of said matchup. But again, it is always sketchy with Raiders wide receivers, considering how important the tight end and running backs are prior to the wide receiver on that team. The Minnesota Vikings giving up a fair share of points. They will take on the Carolina Panthers. Earlier today, Teddy Bridgewater fully practiced. I know Christian McCaffrey is probably leaning towards the direction of not playing. So of course, Teddy Bridgewater's presence will help the wide receivers, in my opinion, just a little bit more than PJ Walker did, even though PJ Walker was giving some fantasy owners some great, overall production out of a DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel when they most needed it. The New York Jets, of course, giving up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers. That's great for maybe Jakeem Grant, but the only wide receiver that I'm interested in either ranking and or trying to start this week is DeVante Parker, of course. Hopefully Tua is looking for a little bit of a revenge game this week. The Tennessee Titans, they played the Indianapolis Colts 2 weeks ago in Week 10. So we've already kind of seen Michael Pittman Jr. take advantage of the matchup, and everybody's played well against that Tennessee defense, whether it's on the ground or through the air. They've produced. That's a good one to take advantage of. The Arizona Cardinals, they will take on the New England Patriots. Not sure exactly which New England Patriot wide receiver is going to be able to pop off this week. But again, we'll go ahead and talk about that as the episode progresses. The Jacksonville Jaguars against Cleveland, Cincinnati playing against the New York Giants, and Houston playing against Detroit. These are fantastic matchups for wide receivers that, of course, aren't in everyone's starting lineups as of right now. So, of course, you have players that have really good matchups and are on the fringe of potentially being a wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4 this week. We'll talk about some of these guys going into this week. But again, just to kind of give you some extra perspective as to how many points these defenses are giving up to opposing wide receivers thus far this year. In terms of the tougher matchups, of course, the Los Angeles Rams are one of those teams. Even though Mike Evans, even Chris Godwin late in the game, and of course, Antonio Brown all had great games individually against the Los Angeles Rams secondary. The wide receiver position has overall struggled heavily against the Los Angeles Rams. That's mainly because, again, like I mentioned last week, the Los Angeles Rams have shut down opposing offenses many times this season. I think it was in 5 different matchups, they forced other opposing quarterbacks to throw 0 passing touchdowns in those 5 games. So, again, they're a great defense. They get after it. The Washington football team, they themselves have been great as of late. In terms of playing up against Andy Dalton, this is going to be an interesting matchup within the division itself. And, of course, a little bit of a revenge game going back and forth. The Chicago Bears, they play well against wide receivers. But, they really haven't faced a Davante Adams type of wide receiver. Sure, they took on a A.J. Brown, and A.J. Brown played well against them, but Davante Adams is a completely different animal in itself. The Kansas City Chiefs, they'll have their hands full with, of course, the entire wide receiver core of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Those 3 guys have been playing well. The Baltimore Ravens, of course, they will have their hands full with the 3 wide receivers of Juju Smith-Schuster, Claypool, and Diontae Johnson, who have been feasting. But either way, just giving you some perspective as to some of the tougher matchups going into this week. Even with these tough matchups, there are players that are matchup proof, and then we are going to fire up. You'll kind of get a sense of which guys I'm confident in based on the rankings. So let's get into that, shall we? Here we go. We're getting into our top 36 wide receiver rankings for a half PPR scoring format. Again, if you've come this far and you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. And again, there are timestamps in the description for those of you who are interested. Okay, let's get into this, shall we? We're going to go through this pretty quickly because, again, we have a quarterback video to release later this afternoon. So let's get to this, shall we? Tyreek Hill is our number 1 overall wide receiver for this week, and not by really a surprise. In terms of opportunity and volume of opportunity in comparison to other wide receivers, Tyreek Hill has been absolutely insane. In terms of scoring touchdowns, he has already scored 11 touchdowns this season. He's tied with Adam Thielen in terms of overall total touchdowns at the wide receiver position, just coming off of a performance with 14 targets, 11 receptions, 102 receiving yards, and a touchdown against the Las Vegas Raiders in Las Vegas. Again, this is Tyreek Hill at his absolute best. Every single week he is producing these kind of numbers, whether it is getting over 100 yards, whether it's 10 receptions, whether it's getting an incredible volume of targets. In the last 2 weeks, he's had 32 targets in this offense. So it really shouldn't be a surprise that Tyreek Hill is up here. He's scoring touchdowns galore. I mean, just prior to the game that he just played against the Las Vegas Raiders, the 2 games prior to that, he scored 2 touchdowns in each of them. So Tyreek Hill is at an all-time high. We always had concerns about his volatility, but at this point, we have no concern at all. We're firing him up. He is the best wide receiver, in my opinion, this upcoming week, based on the fact that if you just go and watch what Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp were able to do to that Tampa Bay defense and that secondary, my goodness, Tyreek Hill is going to have a very enjoyable time, especially considering his speed in comparison to other wide receivers in the National Football League. And of course, that secondary in Tampa Bay. I think Tyreek Hill, fantastic play, as my number 1. Moving on to our number 2, we have ourselves Davante Adams. Of course, he's another one of these animals. In the last 5 games, Davante Adams has had 8 receiving touchdowns. That in itself, an insane number. Just this past week, he's coming off of a performance of 7 receptions, 106 receiving yards, and a touchdown against the Indianapolis Colts secondary that, of course, we all know is one of the best secondaries in the National Football League. But like we talked last week, Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers, that combination cannot be stopped. It is matchup proof regardless of what you're going against. And though they play against the Chicago Bears this week, a defense that doesn't give up many points to opposing wide receivers, I mean, we've seen Davante Adams produced heavily against them. Just going back to late last season, 2019, he had 13 targets, 7 receptions, 103 receiving yards, and a touchdown the last time he played against the Chicago Bears. Those are almost identical numbers of what he just put up against the Indianapolis Colts. I don't put it past him to perhaps get similar numbers to that, score 1 to maybe even 2 touchdowns, because that is what he is getting capable of and he's getting open for. Again, this offense is continuing to score a lot of points with Aaron Rodgers playing at an all-time high, in my opinion. I think as of right now, Davante Adams, an automatic play going forward. We have DK Metcalf as our number 3. And the thing that excites me about DK Metcalf isn't the fact that, hey, he scored and kind of got past this issue of, hey, when you go against a stud cornerback like Jalen Ramsey or Patrick Peterson, he gets shut down. But the fact that DK Metcalf plays against Darius Slayton this week doesn't really, kind of scare me to an extent, because I do agree that DK Metcalf, regardless of what he's faced against, is going to produce as long as he's given the ample opportunity. Last week, he only had 5 targets. Of course, that's only going to lead to 3 receptions. When he gets upwards of 10 targets, like he did against the 49ers, he had like 16 targets. Of course, that led to 12 receptions. It's a matter of whether or not Russell Wilson's going to get him the ball. And what we know and what we've seen When DK Metcalf has faced the Philadelphia Eagles in the past, he's getting the ball in his direction. DK Metcalf last saw the Philadelphia Eagles in the first round of the 2019 playoffs. In that matchup, he had himself 9 targets, 6 receptions, 160 yards, and a touchdown. That was honestly his breakout performance that maybe should have given us more of a inkling that, yeah, maybe he's going to pop off in 2020. But either way, we've seen him produce against that Philadelphia Eagles defense. I'm not worried about the coverage. I think, of course, this is going to be a matchup where it's a matter of whether Russell Wilson can get him the ball more times than not. If, in fact, the defense is going to force it away from him, then so be it. But regardless, DK Metcalf is in our lineups because of what his high upside looks like and what his floor typically is with basically getting himself a touchdown every week. We have Keenan Allen as our number 4. And Keenan Allen is coming off of a week of which this is the second time this year he's had 19 total targets in a singular game. That obviously led to 16 receptions, 145 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. I mean, can he be stopped? Probably not. With Justin Herbert feeding him the ball that many times a game, of course, the New York Jets really couldn't have an answer for him. Their defense struggling. And to be honest, as long as Keenan Allen is as confident as he is, as healthy as he is, no one's going to stop him. Playing against the Buffalo Bills, we've seen multiple number 1 wide receivers torch Tre'Davious White this season. And just recently, DeAndre Hopkins went for 7 catches, 127 and a touchdown. Of course, the Hail Mary at the end made a big difference. But DK Metcalf the week before that, 7 catches, 108 yards and a touchdown. So we've certainly seen number 1 wide receivers produce against the Buffalo Bills defense. I think as long as Keenan Allen is getting the ample opportunity, which he always will be getting, I think if I'm not mistaken, he has the most targets amongst all wide receivers this season with 112. He's going to continue to get fed the ball. And that is only going to lead to his success this upcoming week against Buffalo in a matchup that should be high scoring back and forth. Keenan Allen should be a great play. On the other side of that matchup, we have Stefon Diggs. I mean, it should be pretty easy. I mean, Stefon Diggs is one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, especially in fantasy football, and a lot of people don't give him credit for it. Just looking at his statistics, he's only had one singular game this season of less than 12 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. On top of that, this upcoming week, John Brown, off the bye week, is still dealing with an injury. So where does that leave? That leaves Stefon Diggs getting even more targets. And does he need even more targets? Probably not. He's pretty stable at this point and pretty consistent at this point. But when I went and I looked at his stats and what he's done already this season, even though his touchdown count isn't as high as he'd like it or we'd like it at this point, just looking at his overall statistics and the main contributing statistics, he's number 2 in the National Football League in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. That in itself just proves to you just how valuable Stefon Diggs is to that offense and going up against the Los Angeles Chargers defense that has given up a boatload of points as of late. Stefon Diggs is a fantastic play. We have DeAndre Hopkins, of course. He's a little bit lower than we usually anticipate and or have him. He's coming off of a performance in which he did not play well. 5 catches for 51 yards and 0 touchdowns is not what we're anticipating, especially when you play against the Seattle Seahawks defense that gives up a lot of points. That in itself, I wanted to go ahead and just kind of giving you guys a little bit of a snapshot. If you go and you just pull up DeAndre Hopkins' stats this season alone, every other week he has a 100-yard receiving game. Last week was the odd week. This upcoming week, it should be that he's getting back on track. But if you go and look at it, it's kind of ridiculous. Week 1, he has it. Week 2, nothing. Week 3 has it. Week 4, nothing. Week 5 has the 100-yard touch. You know, he's just that kind of a guy. Every other week, he's having a 100-yard game. This week should be it. Now, he does have to go up against Stephon Gilmore. Gilly is one of, if not the best cornerbacks in the National Football League. That is going to be tough for him. I know Will Fuller had 6 catches for 80 yards against them, and Brandin Cooks had 4 catches for 85 yards against them just this past week, but they weren't able to find the end zone because, of course, that secondary is good. So the yardage might be there this week. The touchdown is definitely the upside. We're hoping that Kyler Murray is healthy, ready to go, and able to get the ball in DeAndre Hopkins' direction. Of course, we know what he's capable of, so hopefully he'll get it done. We have Michael Thomas as our number 7. A lot of people were worried about Michael Thomas and his overall productivity if, in fact, Taysom Hill was going to be the starting quarterback. I wasn't worried about it. I'm glad it came through as projected. 12 total targets last week, 9 receptions for 104 receiving yards. We'd, of course, like to accompany that with a touchdown, but we're going to have to be patient. This week, I think, is a week that we could perhaps see that because, of course, the Denver Broncos and their secondary have struggled all season long. Just to kind of give you some perspective as to some of the performances they've given up as of late. DeVante Parker as of late, 6 catches, 61 yards, and a touchdown. That was just this past week. Julio had 5 catches, 54 and a touchdown, while Zacchaeus on the same offense, 4 catches, 104 and a touchdown. Keenan Allen a couple weeks back, 9, 67 and 1 against them. Mike Williams in the same game, 5 catches, 99 yards, and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 6 catches, 55 yards, touchdown. So we've seen number 1 wide receivers and even number 2 wide receivers in respective offenses play up against the Denver Broncos secondary and succeed. I think Michael Thomas, regardless of who's playing at the quarterback position, is such a mainstream part of this offense and is going to consistently get targets regardless of who's under center. I think Michael Thomas, especially considering what we saw Taysom Hill do in terms of 18 for throwing, 23 passing, being an efficient thrower, it just seems like Michael Thomas is in very good hands right now, and going forward should be a great play. We have number 8, Calvin Ridley. Okay, so I'm anticipating that Julio Jones is probably going to miss. If he left the game with a hamstring injury, the chances of him returning the following week without the injury and not feeling a little bit, hamstrung per se with the injury is kind of unlikely. So I'm anticipating, of course, Julio Jones to miss. If that's the case, Calvin Ridley is in line for a great performance. Now, the thing that I wanted to mention specifically, when Calvin Ridley has been in the lineup and Julio Jones has not been there, it's been 2 games already this season and that's happened. In those 2 games, Calvin Ridley has had 13 receptions and 246 receiving yards. So just to put it in perspective, it's about 6.5 catches per game when Julio is out and 120-ish receiving yards. So that in itself, a great number to see. He plays against the Las Vegas Raiders secondary. Of course, just going back to the last couple weeks, Tyreek Hill just last week, 11 catches, 102 and a touchdown. Keenan Allen, 9 catches, 103 and a touchdown. Chris Godwin, 9 catches, 88 yards and a touchdown. All these number 1 wide receivers are producing against that secondary. They are definitely capable of doing so. And I think, of course, Calvin Ridley, if in fact Matt Ryan wants to figure it out, can definitely get him the ball and definitely get him into the fantasy relevant top 8, in my opinion. We have Adam Thielen as our number 9 wide receiver. So Adam Thielen, as of right now, hasn't been cleared to play, but I anticipate by Sunday he will be cleared. In that same vein, Adam Thielen's been unbelievable this season. He has the most receiving touchdowns amongst all wide receivers with 11. Adam Thielen is coming off of a performance against the Dallas Cowboys, in which he had 11 targets, 8 receptions, $123 and 2 touchdowns. The amount of 2 touchdown games he has had in his career, and already just this season, is insane. But Adam Thielen is such a consistent part of that offense that regardless, I expect him to play. Hopefully he'll be there. If he's not, then we'll have to upgrade Justin Jefferson from where he's currently ranked. But looking at the Carolina Panthers matchup this week, again, there are wide receivers that have produced against these defenses every single week this season. And even though they don't give up many points to opposing wide receivers, teams have definitely been able to take advantage of it. Just looking at Mike Evans as of late, 6 catches, 77 yards and a touchdown. We had Tyreek Hill, 9 catches, 113 and 2 touchdowns just a couple weeks back in that back and forth matchup between those 2 teams. We had Julio for 7 and 137 and Calvin Ridley in the same game, 8 for 136. So of course, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, that combo should be able to take the top off of the Carolina Panthers defense, while of course Dalvin Cook is running the ball down their throats. It's going to be tough for them to stop the run, and of course it's going to open up play action for Adam Thielen. We have Terry McLaurin as our number 10. We talked about this earlier in terms of the matchups. The Dallas Cowboys give up the second most points to opposing wide receivers this season. Going back to week 7, in which Terry McLaurin and the Washington football team took on the Dallas Cowboys. Terry McLaurin came off of a performance of 11 targets, 7 receptions, 90 yards, and a touchdown. That in itself is all we're looking for. This past week, he wasn't utilized as much in the second half because, of course, you didn't have to use him when Joe Burrow goes down. The offense of the Cincinnati Bengals disappears, and all you have to do is run the ball as the Washington football team to secure the win. That's what they did. They secured the win. That being said, Terry McLaurin still had himself 5 catches and 84 receiving yards. He could have gotten himself an even better game in terms of overall productivity, but unfortunately wasn't the case. Now, when we think about what the Dallas Cowboys have given up, I just mentioned it with Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen's coming off of a game, and in combination with Justin Jefferson, if I just add both of their statistics, that's 209 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns between those 2 wide receivers. When we go back and we look at what the Pittsburgh Steelers did against the Dallas Cowboys, even though Pittsburgh did not win by a wide margin, the wide receivers on that team put up 239 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Rieger and Fulgham a couple weeks back, 94 and 2 receiving touchdowns between the 2 of them. And then we also had Christian Kirk and DeAndre Hopkins between the 2 of them, 159 and 2 touchdowns. If Terry McLaurin by himself can't end up producing when everyone's feasting on this defense, I'm going to be very much so surprised. I know this Dallas Cowboys team looks like they've turned over a new leaf in terms of being able to win, but their defense is still as bad and can still be exposed. We move on to Tyler Lockett as my number 11. Of course, Tyler Lockett, I wish he could play against the Cardinals every week. I mean, don't you guys just wish that? Every time he plays against the Cardinals, they don't have an answer for him. He's coming off a week in which he had 9 targets, 9 receptions, 67 yards and a touchdown while he had a knee sprain, and we thought he wasn't going to play. I mean, my goodness, Tyler Lockett. Play the Cardinals every week. If we can get that set up, that'd be fantastic. But in all reality, he plays against the Philadelphia Eagles. I know DK Metcalf is going to be pulling a lot of coverage. That'll leave the second best cornerback on every team for Tyler Lockett. He's going to be a guy that's going to get targets, and it's probably going to be at a similar capacity in comparison to what it was last week. I think Tyler Lockett does have his inconsistencies, but at the same time, he has such a high ceiling with how productive this offense has been and how efficient Russell Wilson has been down in the red zone. So with Chris Carson back, they're definitely going to be able to move the ball even more efficiently, get down in the red zone, be able to put numbers up on this Philadelphia defense. Their offense might struggle, the Philadelphia one that is, and it will give them more and more opportunities. I think, again, Tyler Lockett, another one of these safe plays, another one of these safe wide receivers that has so much built-in value and upside. You just can't leave him out of your lineup. We have Diontae Johnson as our number 12. So Diontae Johnson at this moment in time, again, is in the top 12 for the second week in a row. He produced, once again, 16 total targets this past week, 12 receptions for 111 receiving yards. That's insane. Those numbers, the fact that he's coming off of back-to-back 110 plus receiving yard games in this offense, and like I've mentioned earlier this season, and I will continue to mention, in full games that he has played, he's averaging 12.5 targets per game from Ben Roethlisberger. That is insane. He plays against the Baltimore Ravens on Sunday Football. Obviously because it's been postponed from Thursday, but as of right now, Diontae Johnson, regardless of the matchup, I am not afraid of Baltimore. I've seen, of course, A.J. Brown and Corey Davis produce against them just this past week, and Diontae Johnson, he's been playing out of his mind. He's got a lot of wide receivers to help pull coverage away from him this week. He should be a fantastic play as my number 12. Number 13 is Chris Godwin. Luckily, Chris Godwin was able to find the end zone. I think, of course, his target count is there. Looking at the numbers, 10 total targets, 7 receptions, 53 yards, and a touchdown. When I looked at the numbers that everyone was pretty much touting after the game on Monday night, which Brady completely was awful in terms of throwing the ball deep, they were all saying that this offense needs to be run deep. They need to throw the ball deep. That's what Jameis was there for. Obviously, Tom Brady can't pull it, and he is extremely efficient in terms of throwing the ball short. That's Tom Brady's MO, right? That's dump the ball to Julian Edelman. That's what they've got to do. They've got to increase Chris Godwin's opportunity, and that in itself is going to lead to more success. I guarantee it. Hopefully, his depth of target increases a little bit more. I know Chris Godwin has burners and can definitely take a skinny post to the house. You just got to get him the opportunity. Against KC, this should be a higher scoring back and forth matchup. Just looking at some of the wide receivers that have produced against them as of late. KC's given up, 88 yards and a touchdown to Nelson Aguilar and 105 yards and a touchdown to Curtis Samuel in just the past 2 games. So, again, I expect Chris Godwin to have himself a good week here. Should be great as my number 13. Number 14 is Robert Woods, coming off a fantastic performance in which he took on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Next to him is Chris Godwin, of course, on the screen. But here's the thing. Robert Woods typically does not play that well. Jared Goff doesn't play that well. But I can tell you this from my perspective as watching as many Rams games as I have in the last 3 years plus. Jared Goff on the first drive will pretty much determine how the game is going to go. If he ends up starting off hot, then it's over. Jared Goff's going to feast along with Robert Woods and or Cooper Kupp. So this upcoming week in San Francisco, it's going to be a big determining factor on off the first drive what we end up seeing. Hopefully, we're going to find some more success as San Francisco's defense hasn't been great as of late. But, Robert Woods getting himself 15 targets, 12 catches, 130 receiving yards, and a touchdown. That in itself, insane. Scoring an early touchdown, we thought, 7 points, we'll take that. You couple that with a couple yards, you're good to go. Instead, he drops another 100 yards for the rest of the 3 quarters and has himself a fantastic performance. San Francisco, they themselves have been struggling against number 1 overall wide receivers. DK Metcalf, 12 catches, 161 and 2 touchdowns. Davante Adams, 10 catches, 173 and a touchdown. While MVS in that same game went for 253 and 2. And Robert Woods earlier this season, 4 catches, 29 yards on a touchdown. Of course, had 10 targets in that game, but wasn't able to garner all of them. But either way, Robert Woods coming off a hot performance, playing against San Francisco, should be a good play. Moving on to our number 15 wide receiver, we have ourselves Will Fuller. Of course, I mean, he's coming off of a performance in which he played well, in my opinion, against Bill Belichick's secondary. When you play against Stephon Gilmore and Devin McCourty, you're not expected to have insane games. Unless, of course, you are somehow DK Metcalf and you're dominating against Gilmore because he can't keep up with you. But I think Will Fuller having 6 catches for 80 yards is a great game. Playing against Detroit this week, in my opinion, though Detroit doesn't give up that many receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers, receivers have played well against them in the last couple weeks. I mean, DJ Moore coming off of a 127-yard performance, Curtis Samuel 80 yards and a touchdown. The week before, Terry McLaurin 95 yards on 7 catches. So again, wide receivers have produced against them. When you look at the Detroit Lions and how much they give up to opposing wide receivers, though it's not the top echelon in terms of matchups, they are still giving up the 6th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers this season, which is definitely something that we want to see. We want to see a back and forth matchup between these two teams. Of course, these are two teams that really don't have defenses. They're pretty much reliant on their offense to carry the game. I think DeAndre Swift against the Houston defense should be advantageous. And on the opposite end, if Deshaun Watson has to throw the ball the entire time, which I anticipate he's going to do so, it is going to feast for Brandin Cooks and most definitely Will Fuller. I think he's going to be a great play this week. We have number 16, Cooper Kupp, another one of these wide receivers that is coming off an insane performance. I mean, 11 catches on 13 targets for $145. Just looking at what Cooper Kupp has done in the last 3 weeks gives me so much confidence for the rest of the season. In the last 3 weeks alone, Cooper Kupp has had 40 targets. Oh my goodness, is that insane? On those 40 targets, he's averaging about 11 yards per catch. He's had 27 total catches, so that kind of gives you a perspective as to how many yards he's getting per the last 3 weeks. As of right now, he plays against San Francisco. In his career since 2019 and 2020 thus far, he hasn't played well against San Francisco. They have locked him down consistently. But if we are going to see Cooper Kupp get an upward of 10 plus targets on a consistent basis, then my goodness, he is going to be able to feast. He is catching majority of the passes that go in his direction, and I'm confident that Cooper Kupp's given the ample opportunity, he should be able to produce. Man, 40 targets in the last 3 games. I mean, Tyreek Hill, 32 in the last 2 games is a pretty big difference. But with Cooper Kupp as a slot receiver who definitely needs the catches because he isn't scoring as many touchdowns as he did last year, it definitely can be a huge difference maker for his overall value. Chase Claypool is our number 17 wide receiver for this week. And again, I mean, playing against the Baltimore Ravens, even though it is a little bit hesitant, I'm a little bit hesitant on the matchup and thinking to myself, hey, is he going to be able to produce? I mean, he did it earlier this year. I mean, just a couple weeks back, he scored a touchdown against them, was able to help get his team over the hump and win against that Baltimore secondary. And again, he is a guy that is getting consistent targets and consistent touchdowns to the point where he's the first rookie wide receiver in NFL history to score 10 touchdowns in the first 10 games of his career. Chase Claypool is setting records. His team is undefeated. They are playing out of their minds. And I think this upcoming week, of course, Chase Claypool is going to be asked to do a lot. Even though his reception count isn't as high as Diontae Johnson, even though his targets aren't as high as Diontae Johnson, he is a 6'5" monster that is going to be running down the field and scoring touchdowns. And that's what we know he's capable of. And that's what we expect him to do every single week, regardless of the matchup, of course. I think we've seen him play against tough matchups before, and regardless, still ends up putting up good performances. He is my number 17 this week. I love these rookie wide receivers. Speaking of another rookie wide receiver, we have Justin Jefferson coming off of back-to-back performances of just absolute bliss. This past week, 3 catches, 86 yards, and a touchdown, only on 5 targets. Of course, we would have loved to see him get more against Dallas, but we'll take it. We'll take that. The week prior, I mean, he had his most opportunity against Chicago of all defenses with 10 targets, 8 receptions, and $135. This is a wide receiver that is within the top 12 in terms of overall points, is in the top, 7 in terms of overall receiving yards this season, in which, of course, he's putting up a lot of 100-yard receiving games already. I think the Carolina matchup, like we talked about a little bit earlier with Adam Thielen, they've given up a bunch of yards to opposing wide receivers. Tyreek went for over 100, Julio went for over 130, and so did Calvin Ridley. So, again, if Justin Jefferson just gets a couple opportunities here and there, could end up having himself another breakout performance. We have number 19, A.J. Brown. So, here's my only concern. A.J. Brown played against the Indianapolis Colts in Week 10. In that game, he had 4 targets, 1 catch, 21 yards, 0 touchdowns. That in itself, pretty concerning. Of course, if in fact he's played against Baltimore and produced well, just like he did this last week, he had 4 catches, 62 yards, and a touchdown, and carried defenders into the end zone. And we've seen him produce against Chicago just a couple weeks back. We know he could play against tough secondaries. Baltimore and Chicago have great cornerbacks, and I know that the Indianapolis Colts do as well. But the question is, what happened in that game and what is going to be the biggest difference maker in order to kind of open up more opportunity for A.J. Brown, I think it's just purely targets. I think it's a matter of being able to run the ball more, being able to move the chains and get your wide receiver like an A.J. Brown more opportunity. I think they'll be able to do so. I think 4 targets, of course, is not enough. He's got to be able to get at least 7 to 8 to 9 targets because he's only catching the ball 4 to 5 times per game. And when you're catching the ball that limitedly, and of course the opportunity is not there as much, he needs to be able to get a couple more in his direction to be able to at least hold him over in terms of fantasy. I think they'll be able to do so this week. We have Mike Evans as our number 20. Mike Evans is coming off a great performance in which I really didn't think he was going to end up doing. Again, we watched it. I'm sure you were, watching that Monday Night Football game. Jalen Ramsey was on him like white on rice. He was not letting him do anything. He was, picking him up, suplexing him on the ground. And the only time that Mike Evans ran freely is because they motioned him out. They brought Chris Godwin back on this side. Ramsey was on Godwin, and Mike Evans dominated 2 smaller cornerbacks and was able to score. I think, of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they want to scheme up things like that. They want to get him away from number 1 cornerbacks because it just opens up more opportunity. I think Mike Evans right now, this season is somewhat touchdown dependent, but the fact that he scored 9 already just means that it's consistent at this point. I don't think it's a dependency. Of course, the 2 games in which he hasn't scored touchdowns this year, those are his lowest scoring performances, of course. But I think at this point, the amount of targets he's getting, the amount of opportunities he's getting, especially down in the red zone, it's become a consistency factor that he is going to score and he is going to get upwards of 10 fantasy points. And with that, I find safety and some sort of security. He's my number 20. We have DJ Moore as our number 21, coming off of a fantastic performance of 11 targets, 7 receptions, and 127 receiving yards with PJ Walker at the quarterback position. I expect PJ Walker to probably play, but if Teddy Bridgewater is going to be there and he's going to be present and going to be able to deliver the ball to DJ Moore, then I'm pretty excited about this overall potential. Just looking at what DJ Moore has done since week 5, he's been the number 7 overall wide receiver in half PPR fantasy. He's had 5 out of his 7 games of 90 plus receiving yards. We've seen, of course, DJ Moore take the next step after the first quarter of the season where with of course, Teddy Bridgewater kind of finding himself, of course, feeding Robbie Anderson more and more every week. I think we've kind of balanced ourselves with DJ Moore getting the number 1 overall wide receiver spot on this team. When we talk about the Minnesota Vikings matchup, I mean, could we say much less? I mean, they get scored on purely. I think they're giving up nearly 2 receiving touchdowns per game to opposing wide receivers. DK, just a couple weeks back, 6 catches, 93 yards, 2 touchdowns. Julio, 8 catches, 137 yards, 2 touchdowns. Davante Adams, 7 catches, 53 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. When you're a top wide receiver and you play against Minnesota, expect to score. I expect DJ Moore to have himself a pretty big week here. We have Brandin Cooks as our number 22. So Brandin Cooks, again, similar to Will Fuller in the same vein, played well against that New England secondary. He plays against the Detroit Lions now. I don't think the Detroit Lions are built in a way that they can stop the attack of Deshaun Watson, especially off the performance he had last week. I think he's going to take that momentum and continue. The thing that I like more about Brandin Cooks this week and why I have him at my number 22 is based purely on the fact that Randall Cobb and Kenny Stills are both going to be out. I think Will Fuller's opportunity and productivity is all built in based on the fact that that combination between Watson and Fuller has been so successful over the last 3 seasons. But Brandin Cooks being a new wide receiver in this offense, needing to earn his targets, needing to earn his trust, now that there's no other pieces in this offense and we're always trending in the direction of getting Brandin Cooks the ball more and more every single week, it just seems to me that this number 1 and 2 combo between Fuller and Brandin Cooks should have themselves a monster game this upcoming Thursday. Should be exciting to see. I think Brandin Cooks should be able to have a nice pop-off game. We have Amari Cooper as a number 23 playing against the Washington football team. I understand that the Washington football team, they're giving up the second fewest points to opposing wide receivers. Not too worried about it. I think, of course, Amari Cooper proved that he is the number 1 wide receiver of this team with 7 targets, 6 catches for 81 total yards this past Sunday against the Minnesota Vikings. Wasn't able to find the end zone, but as we progressively go, Andy Dalton is going to get more comfortable in this offense and find and build more relationships with these receivers. Of course, CeeDee Lamb making an incredible catch, scoring a touchdown. Dalton Schultz in the end zone catching a touchdown. And the last receiving touchdown went to Zeke. Those were all in the red zone. If, in fact, you get Amari Cooper on a perfect route, I guarantee you he could possibly score this week and get you, extra upside. Besides the fact that he's probably a guy that's going to get upwards of 10 fantasy points just based on yardage and receptions, the upside of a touchdown is always available there. And as this offense is trending in the right direction, I think it's very capable for him to do that this week. We have Allen Robinson as our number 24. I think Allen Robinson coming off of the bye week playing against Green Bay, all we can really look towards is what his potential is. We've seen Allen Robinson play well against his defense. We've seen him, regardless of the quarterback position, play well. With Mitchell Trubisky last season, just giving you some perspective, against Green Bay in the two matchups, one was in week 1 and one was, I think, week 13 of last season. In week 1, 13 total targets, 7 catches, 102 yards, 0 touchdowns. But again, 7 catches for 102, great. In the next game against the Green Bay Packers in 2019, 14 targets, 7 catches, 125 yards. So again, he's had 7 catches and 100 plus in the last 2 games against Green Bay. I think, again, Allen Robinson is one of the more talented wide receivers in the National Football League. He isn't probably given as much opportunity as he deserves, and the quarterback play hasn't been as great to him as it possibly needs. I know his agent's been complaining to hope and get him the ball. Somehow, Allen Robinson's managed to find himself with Blake Bortles, Mitchell Trubisky, and Nick Foles in the last, part of his career, and it's just been unfortunate. But regardless, I think he'll still be able to produce this week as the number 1 wide receiver of the Bears. We have Marvin Jones Jr. as our number 25, with Kenny Golladay most likely out again this week because they have to play on Thursday. It's a short week. Still dealing with a hip injury. Will most likely be returning in week 13 prior to the fantasy football playoffs. I think, of course, Marvin Jones Jr., we know what he's capable of. He has scored a lot of touchdowns in the last couple of weeks. Their offense got shut down this past week. This was the first time in a very long time the Detroit Lions did not have a single opportunity in the red zone. Again, their offense got completely shut down. I think they'll come out, they'll play better. I looked at the stats in games in which, of course, Matthew Stafford has played on Thanksgiving Day. He's a different quarterback. He has had some incredible performances throughout his career. Obviously, in the middle half prior to the injuries of his rookie seasons, and that offense just completely being a dud, entire team. But regardless, I think as of right now, going into this matchup without a number 1 wide receiver, Danny Amendola is still a little bit tricky, and figuring that out. I think, of course, Marvin Jones, who has scored, 4 touchdowns in the last 5 games, should be able to have himself a great performance. DeVante Parker is my number 26. As long as Tua is coming out to prove something, I know they've said Tua is not injured. He, was benched because of performance reasons and because they anticipated that they had to come back to score a game. Ryan Fitzpatrick gave them the best opportunity. That should fire up Tua. That should piss him off, and that should get him ready, not only to feed the ball to DeVante Parker, but to prove to everyone, and especially against a rival like the Jets, that, hey, I'm here to stay. I am the number 2 overall or the number 3 overall pick of this draft for a reason. I was selected to come in here and dominate for this team. We've yet to see him do so. We've yet to see him make huge plays. Hopefully this is the week, and especially for DeVante Parker owners, you'd love to see what Fitzpatrick is getting in his direction. Hopefully we'll see a similar target count going forward. We have CeeDee Lamb as my number 27. Again, I trust these Cowboys wide receivers because I know how much talent they have. I know what kind of upside they have because they've proven it already this season with Dak. So as long as Andy Dalton can get in the right position and feed them the ball, CeeDee Lamb could be the Tyler Boyd of this offense. He could be the slot receiver that runs around, gets himself upwards of 10 targets, and feasts on this defense. I mean, of course, the Washington football team, they've got a good secondary, and they've proven that this season. But I truly do think that CeeDee Lamb is a integral part of this offense, and as long as they're continuing to pass the ball, CeeDee Lamb's going to see a lot of targets in his direction. He is going to continue to build a rapport with Andy Dalton and find himself as a pretty good value play this week against Washington. We have Curtis Samuel as our number 28. I've mentioned it earlier this week. Since week 7, Curtis Samuel is the number 5 overall wide receiver in fantasy. In that time, he even has more points than DK Metcalf. Just to kind of put it in perspective, Curtis Samuel has been a monster, coming off of a performance of 10 targets, 8 receptions, 70 yards, and a receiving touchdown, playing against the Minnesota Vikings this upcoming week. We talked about it with DJ Moore. Number 1 wide receivers are feasting against this defense, but as it kind of seems, Curtis Samuel is almost becoming the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. Slowly, but surely it's getting there. Robbie Anderson's kind of fading out. There are weeks of inconsistency with DJ Moore, and I think Curtis Samuel, having only 1 bad week since week 7, has kind of, in my opinion, proven he can be trusted, and I will trust him this week. That's why he sits at 28. I'm going to continue to rely upon his upside and his ability to get targets in that offense, which leads to his safe floor, but of course, the ability to just take one to the house, whether it's out of the backfield or, on a screen pass deep, doesn't matter. Curtis Samuel can do it all. Moving on to our number 29 wide receiver, we have ourselves Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, when I think about this offense, I think to myself, Diontae Johnson averaging 12 targets per game in full games, beautiful. Chase Claypool, 10 touchdowns in 10 games, beautiful. Eric Ebron, as of late, has been I think he's the number 5 tight end since week 7. James Conner, Benny Snell, they're yoinking touchdowns in the red zone. This offense has been built, and where Juju pretty much functions and kind of at least contributes the most is from the slot position. And I think based on his average depth of target, based on what he's getting in terms of target share in this offense, yes, he's had a couple surge games as of late, but it's nothing to be too excited about. I think going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, it's definitely a tougher one for Juju Smith-Schuster in specific. I think he's definitely struggled throughout his career against Baltimore, and I don't think that's going to change this upcoming week. Sure, he's going to be able to get catches and contribute to an extent, but I don't think he is the number 1 or 2, maybe even 3 offensive option in this offense as of right now, and that is why Juju Smith-Schuster sits down here. My goodness, I keep messing that up, but regardless, I still think that he has value this week. It's just not as high as it typically was, especially last week, considering the matchup in which he pretty much was a dud in. We have ourselves Antonio Brown, and based on just pure targets, the target share is just, and the sheer volume is unbelievable. I mean, in the last 2 games, he's had 21 total targets. He's getting himself jet sweep handoffs. He's getting himself touches. Of course, against the Los Angeles Rams, 8 catches for 57 yards. The AB of old would have been able to catch that 9 route in which Brady put it right on his fingertips. He would have caught that, and that would have potentially even been a receiving touchdown. That would have been the AB of old, but maybe he's, a half a step behind what he used to be. But as of right now, if Brady's going to look to him as much as he has, and get him upwards of 13 targets or somewhere close to that number, 9 to 10 targets per game, my goodness, that is going to be a fantastic thing for Antonio Brown, especially in full PPR, considering he hasn't scored a touchdown yet. But in a half PPR scoring format, he is solidifying himself as a wide receiver 3 option with upside. I think this upcoming week in a matchup, of course, where they're going to have to score a lot to keep up with Mahomes, I think AB will be a big part of the offense as my number 30. We have Christian Kirk as our 31. Christian Kirk has kind of been quiet as of late. After those huge games in which he was scoring multiple touchdowns and being a huge part of this offense and letting Kyler just guide him to success, of course, it hasn't been great. Just this past week against Seattle, only 4 catches for 50 yards. But again, both DeAndre Hopkins and Christian Kirk both struggled in that game, based purely on the inefficiencies of Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray could have even won that game if he was a little bit quicker to pass the ball to either Larry Fitzgerald or Andy Isabella in the late game. But either way, I think as of right now, this offense, they have a pretty tough task on hand. They have to play against the New England Patriots. He'll probably have Devin McCourty on him. These are secondary players that are no joke, and they're going to play well. I think Christian Kirk still has the upside of a touchdown, but he's nothing to 100% be too happy about based on the matchup this week. We have Sterling Shepard playing against Cincinnati, coming off the bye week. In the last 4 games that Sterling Shepard has played since coming off of the IR, he's at 32 total targets. That's 8 targets per game in an offense in which, of course, you are playing against Cincinnati. It's going to be easy to score. I anticipate that. I think Daniel Jones will be a great play this week. I think Wengoma will be good. But Darius Slayton, the question is, can he get enough targets? As long as we're seeing Sterling Shepard get targets, then I think he's the number 1 wide receiver there. He's going to be able to pull secondary coverage. I think, of course, if you're playing against the second best corner of a defense, you are in a much better opportunity. And I think as of right now, Sterling Shepard kind of, in my opinion, pulls a little bit of the favor in my eyes. We have Michael Pittman Jr. as our number 33. Just a couple weeks back, again in Week 10, he played against the Tennessee Titans. The Indianapolis Colts definitely did win that game, but in that game, he was able to get 7 catches for 101 receiving yards. He's coming off of a performance of 3 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. And as of right now, I think there is a safe floor with Michael Pittman Jr. being the number 1 wide receiver, playing the most snaps amongst all wide receivers in the Indianapolis Colts offense. Being able to just be on the field will get him more opportunities and get him more touches. I mean, it just seems to me that Michael Pittman should be a good play this week. 34 is Mike Williams. I know Mike Williams, in 3 out of the last 4 performances, he's had at least 4 receptions and 70 receiving yards. That in itself, in a half PPR, okay, you got yourself 9 points. And then he has himself an upside of touchdown. He has scored 2 touchdowns in the last 4 games. I think as long as we are playing against Buffalo, I think Josh Norman comes back as the number 2 corner. There's a very good chance that Mike Williams should be able to match up well with him. But Josh Norman, again, is one of those bigger cornerbacks that could play against a Mike Williams and be able to body him up a little bit. So I still think that Mike Williams has value based on, of course, Herbert and Keenan Allen playing as well as they have. But again, not as much value as he had last week against the Jets. Moving on to our number 35, we have ourselves Cole Beasley. So Cole Beasley, as right now, a safe play. He's a guy that can possibly get you 10 fantasy points and you're going to be perfectly happy with it. And that's what I'm anticipating. I'm anticipating, because of the fact that John Brown has been injured and is still going to be perhaps limited this week, that there's a chance that Cole Beasley sees an even greater expanse in terms of his opportunity in this offense. Of course, we've seen games in which he completely disappears and games in which he is the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. So that kind of volatility is definitely dangerous. But as of right now, based on the fact that the Los Angeles Chargers, again, they did trade away their best slot corner, Desmond King, it just seems to me that Cole Beasley could be in line for a good amount of targets this week and help Josh Allen out in a matchup in which, of course, they should be scoring a lot. I think the last couple players, I want to make it two different players. I want to talk about Tyler Boyd first and foremost. I think a lot of you guys who have Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins are wondering, are we going to find any value in Ryan Finley? I think the answer is probably a negative. That's why I have him at 36. I think he is on the fringe of legitimately being a wide receiver 4, which is dangerous because, again, if you are in a tougher matchup like he is against the New York Giants defense, and again, this quarterback has been known to have a 47% passing completion percentage in his career, it is tough for me to trust Tyler Boyd. In the same vein, the other player that I have at 36 is DJ Chark, another player that as of right now is in an offense that is going to have Mike Glennon as the starting quarterback. That in itself scares me and makes me want to avoid these guys. That being said, they are both in somewhat advantageous matchups. When you play against the New York Giants, you'll have Bradbury outside on T. Higgins or AJ Green. Perhaps the potential of a Tyler Boyd inside scoring is there. I mean, we've seen it last season. Ryan Finley had himself, a pretty good game with Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd, I think it was 5 catches, 101 and a touchdown. So again, that's not a bad performance. We've seen DJ Chark, regardless of the quarterback, whether it's Luton, whether it's Foles, whether it's Minshew, whether it's, my goodness, it doesn't matter. They could just bring up anybody off the street. Chark will produce because he has the talent, but I'm just worried. I'm worried about Mike Glennon. Hopefully, we'll get Minshew back sooner rather than later. But those are my top 36/37 wide receiver rankings for Week 12. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I appreciate you guys supporting the channel. Later this afternoon, we'll have our quarterback rankings video out. Make sure you leave a like button down below, subscribe to the channel, and until later this afternoon, I'll see you guys. Peace.